You know what it came from? It came from Karen Lewis. And that brings me to Elizabeth Todd-Breland. Karen Lewis, I Didn't Come Here to Lie is the name of the book. My Life in Education by Karen Elizabeth and Elizabeth Todd-Breland. Great book. Great leader in the city of Chicago, Karen Lewis. And she would have been right there with me on that riff and probably adding a few MFs and
Absolutely.
along the way. So, Elizabeth, first of all, welcome to my humble podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
So I'd love to get your thoughts before we get started. What would Karen Lewis, we're going to talk a little bit about how you got to write the book and the process of it and the things you learned from doing it and the lessons it holds for education today in the age of Trump. But knowing Karen the way you do, Karen Lewis, the great president of the Chicago Teachers Union, you all know who she is, listeners, because you guys, you're smart. Knowing Karen the way you do, how do you think she would be reacting to this political age?
I think sometimes I hesitate to do sort of like hypotheticals, what would Karen think? But you don't have to do a hypothetical because she said it in her life, right? 10 years ago, over 10 years ago at this point, when she was talking about Rahm and about Bruce Rauner and about the billionaire Ken Griffin and all of these other folks, these dynamics are so similar to what we're experiencing today. Think about it under Rauner when, was it 2016? And he refused to give money, right? That was at the state level, refusing to disperse money to public services like education, holding the state budget hostage. And now we're in a situation where federal funds are being treated in that way. So when you think about the things that she said then, her attack on the billionaire class, being very clear that there's no reason for a billionaire class to be hoarding money while young people and their families and educators are scrambling to get students the bare minimum of what they needed. I think she would be on it today in those same ways that she was then, because in many ways she was a big part of course, with many other people fighting that fight then. Yeah. And I think those tools are so necessary again now.
Yeah, probably even more than they were then. It's as hard as to believe. I mean, you talk about Rauner, Bruce Rauner, governor, that you, the voters of Illinois, thought was a good idea to elect as your governor. Heck of a job, voters. And as you could see, Elizabeth, I don't play. I hold voters accountable. I'm a little different than most. I hold them accountable for the stupid things they do. I'm sorry. I'm sick of coddling voters. Okay, millennials get mad at me. They say I'm voter shaming, but come on, who raises a kid by coddling? Oh, no matter what you do, it's okay with me, it's somebody else's fault. Sorry, Elizabeth, that's how I feel. All right, Elizabeth, before we go further down the road with Karen, talk a little bit about yourself. This is your first visit to our show, so introduce yourself and then we'll get to how you and Karen hooked up to write this book. Go ahead.
Sure, absolutely. So my name is Elizabeth Todd-Breland. I'm a history professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I'm also affiliated faculty in Black Studies. I teach a range of things here: history of Chicago, urban history, African-American history, history of education. I'm also a parent. I'm a former Chicago Public Schools local school council member, and then I also was on the Board of Education for 5.5 years, which was its own adventure. I'm not actually originally from Chicago. I moved here 20 years ago, so I've been here my whole adult life. Came here for school and never left. And so the way that I actually came to this book is that the first book that I wrote was called A Political Education. And it was about the history of race and education organizing in Chicago, and particularly Black education organizing. And so for part of the research for that book, I was doing some research at the Chicago Teachers Union. And in particular, I was looking at all the many editions of the Chicago Union Teacher, which is their newsletter. And, I had to sit there for days, starting in the 1950s and going through every page, just doing this research. And so as part of that, as I was sort of, kind of there somewhat regularly, I was asked, I want to say it was by Jen Johnson, but I won't stick to that. If I could do a lunch and learn, like a brown bag for CTU staff about the research I was doing. So I did this and I came to the, lunch and learn, the brown bag, and I was really excited. I was going to share this research. And my big aha moment was going to be that I was going to talk about this young Black student organizer in the 1960s who was organizing student walkouts. And then the aha moment was going to be, and that person was Karen Lewis. And Karen Lewis was there. So I had never met her in depth before then. And so I talked a little bit, but then I shut up and turned it over to her. And the stories that she told about from her experiences as a child all the way up until, being a teacher and then becoming president of the union, they were incredible. And so afterwards she said, hey, do you want to talk more? And of course I want to talk more. And so I ended up interviewing her for that project, and it became the epilogue of that book. And so a few months later, my friend and editor, Jill Petty, reached out to me and was like, hey, I'm working on this project with Karen Lewis. We want to talk to you. And they brought me in and were like, okay, Elizabeth, we want you to co-author this. And the idea originally was that Karen would write her life story, right? She would write personal anecdotes and things about her life autobiographically. And then I would come in and create historical context around it. So, pulling it up into bigger national conversations, local conversations, adding in historical detail to sort of frame it up. And that's how it started. So she had written about, I don't know, maybe 15 pages, single spaced. And then unfortunately in the fall of 2017, she had a really bad stroke. Now, mind you, this was already after she had the cancer diagnosis in 2014, had surgery, had recovered, was back at the union, and then had this stroke again in fall of 17. And so after that, she wasn't able to write anymore, but she was still able to talk. So we shifted, and instead of her writing, we had these long form conversations that I would tape, and it was very explicit. We are taping this for the book, right? So all the stories she was telling, all the material, all the conversations she was having was so that I could, mold it into book form. And so we did. I think we had about a dozen of those between 2017 and 2020. The last one was in February 2020, right before the pandemic. And then everything shut down. And so at that point, I've been visiting her along with Jill at a number of different places. First, of course, at her office, at her home, but then later at Shirley Ryan Ability Lab, at some of her other rehab spaces, and then ultimately in Deerfield at the Skilled Nursing Center where she would live out her final days. And so I started moving all this information into chapters. And it really was kind of a puzzle piece activity, all these stories and trying to figure out where they went. Now, Karen's a union boss. So we had MOUs, we had a book contract. There were instructions for me on how this was going to go. So I had guidance and I had guardrails along this process. And one of those was that this was going to be her memoir. This is not me writing a biography of her. This was going to be her in her words, in her voice. And so I felt really lucky because the majority of the material that I had at that point from our conversations was about her personal life, her early life, her life outside of the public eye. And most of the kind of holes that there were in the narrative were from the more public facing years of her life. And so there were other ways to get that. I worked with a research assistant here, and fun fact on this, my research assistant for this project, Sakordri Ojo, was one of her former students at King High School. So it was just really special. And Sakordri helped me scrub the internet for like every YouTube clip we could find. We're like, we need something on this topic. And she'd help me scrub the internet, looking for, YouTube clips to sort of fill in some of those holes that were there. But that's really how the process went. And so, of course, after her untimely passing in 2021, I think I had a renewed sense of urgency. Really glad for the support of John Lewis, her husband, throughout all of this. He was there with her all the time, and continued to really shepherd this project through. And of course, Julie and the folks at Haymarket were also really supportive. So that's kind of how we got here.
And do you recall the last conversation you had with Karen?
I don't. I could go back to the transcript. I remember. I remember it was in February 2020. I remember it wasn't, the pandemic stuff wasn't fully clear then. But I remember her still having, really sharp critiques of politics, but also being really reflective about her life. I think in a way that her illness gave her pause to do in a certain way, and her commitment to making sure that this story got out. That I do remember. from each and every one of those conversations, but certainly from that last one.
I can't remember. I've lost track of time. I told you this the last time.
Yeah.
When did Karen die?
She passed away in February 2021.
So
So
that
about a year
last year.
after.
Got you.
Mm-hmm.
So you didn't
Mm-hmm.
talk to her for about a year.
Not in person. We couldn't anymore because of COVID.
Exactly.
Yeah, I couldn't
Exactly.
visit anymore.
And yeah, no, it was I got a call from her. I remember at some point. I don't know why I didn't pick up. I was probably doing a recording. She left a message, and I've kept that message.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes me feel bad. I have thought about this about Karen Lewis, her remarkable tenure as the head of the teachers union and leading the strike, defying Rahm. I began the show by talking about the cowardice that Chicagoans have regarding their powerful mayors. And it's not just the voters, but the mainstream media, a chicken. They're all afraid to take a stand. But they'll take a stand against Brandon. Profiles and courage, guys. And what Karen did was she defied that. She said no. She stood up. She was unafraid to stand up to Rahm. And in Chicago, nobody had seen that. Nobody had seen that kind of defiance in such a public way, Elizabeth, since Daley took over as mayor. I don't know if you were here, but in 89. So think about that. That's let me do the math. Hold on. I went to Evanston High School. 21 years. Okay, it took 21 years of cowardice on the part of the people of Chicago, the leaders of Chicago, the corporate community in Chicago, the media in Chicago. They bent over backwards for Daley and Rahm. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, comes this lady, a Black woman from the south side of Chicago, who stands up to Rahm. And they just try to crush her. Of course they did. They try to crush her because how dare, one, a Black woman stand up to Rahm? Two, how dare anybody stand up to Rahm? Teachers, shut up. Take your money. Get in line. And she was fearless. And that just like blew my freaking mind, Elizabeth. I'd never seen anybody like that. And I would love for you to riff a little bit about Karen's fearlessness.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think it's interesting because it's something that you see across the course of her life. And she talks about this in the memoir from a very early age, as a young child. And I'll give some interesting examples. So one of the stories she tells is about when she decided or told her parents she wasn't going to church anymore. And they were like, wait, what? And she said, yeah, no, I don't really think that y'all believe in this fully. And I'm not certain where I, stand on this. So I'm not going anymore. And, at first her parents certainly pushed back, but eventually they acquiesced. And that's sort of the way it went. But I think you see all these moments. And I should say at the same time, her family, and particularly her father, was really supportive, I think, in supporting her. I mean, remember, she's born in the 50s. She's born in 53. She's a young Black woman growing up in the 50s and 60s and pushing against traditional gender norms. So she calls her father a proto-feminist. And she tells these stories about how, he taught her how to bat and play baseball, and said she was going to be in the All-Star game, taught her how to play football, and said she was going to, be in the NFL one day. And, he didn't tell her at that time that, women weren't in either of these leagues, right? And I think that was something that stuck with her. And so by the time she gets to high school, she's a student protest leader. And she went to Kenwood High School. She went to Kenwood High School in Hyde Park at a time that it had just opened. So Kenwood was a new high school in the late 60s. It was created intentionally as a school for the purposes of integration. So the idea was that, white Hyde Parkers and Black folks who were increasingly growing in population in both Brownsville and coming into the sort of Kenwood, Oakland area, that they would all go to this school. Ultimately, over time, white students started to fall out. And even when it first opened, Black students were the majority. But she was part of a wave of Black student protests across the city in the late 1960s that were demanding community control of schools, that were demanding more Black teachers and more Black administrators. And they were walking out every Monday in the fall. And she talks about some of the teachers pushing back against this and say, well, we're going to fail you if you walk out again. And actually her mom standing up and being like, let me see those grades. They're not going to fail you. Not going to let them fail you. So I think that she had this in her for a long time. This continued when she went to Mount Holyoke. She was involved in organizing and activism there as a Black student. So you see this, like it wasn't something new, I guess, for her to stand up to power. But I do think that coming up in the system, teaching in Chicago public schools for over 20 years before she became union president. I think sometimes we sort of skip over her years as a teacher. She was a veteran educator, right? Had been in multiple parts of the system, had been a union delegate, had been sort of through the ebbs and flow of what unionism meant prior to the time that CORE, the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, came into being. And she was part of that early group. And, one of the things that she says she liked about CORE was that it felt like a study group. They're reading things, they're reading radical works, they're reading works about neoliberalism, people like Naomi Klein, people like my colleague Pauline Littman, and really deconstructing what's going on here. And to your point, what Rahm was doing. And so I think for her, she's an intellectual, right? She went to these prestigious liberal arts colleges. She was studying music, right, at one point, musicology, sociology. She spoke Italian. This is this Renaissance woman who's moved into all these different fields and was a seeker and a learner. And this was a community of other people that were doing the same thing. So that when they were coming to Rahm, they were coming with facts and data and research and arguments, right? And so I think all of those things contributed to her leadership. She's a daughter of Black Chicago. She's a daughter of civil rights politics. But then also that sharp critique of those in power and that sharp critique of capitalism, honestly.
Yeah, no, that was a great riff. Yeah, everything you said, I agree with. And I was thinking about this when I think about Karen, I think about Karen all the time, is follow me in this. It was because she got power, Elizabeth, relatively late in life. I think she was closing in on 60 when she was elected president of the Chicago Teachers Union. And she had lived that life that you just described away from the spotlight. Nobody knew who Karen Lewis was in the city of Chicago except for her students who loved her and her colleagues. I met her through a mutual friend, and she was a dear friend of his at Lane. She did the lights at Lane Tech, which was at Lane. She did the lights for a theater. Randy Bates, shout out. And that's how I met her. She was the lady doing the lights.
Yeah.
Okay. So she wasn't there and, whispering in the ears of influencers in the media and stuff. She was living her life. And I've thought about that. This is such a weird comparison and they're totally different what they did. But I think of Harry Truman, who had lived an entire life and all of a sudden was thrust into the White House. And he was just going to be Harry Truman. He wasn't going to just be some other yell. He was Harry Truman, and that's who he was going to be, for better or for worse. And I think of Karen Jennings Lewis. She has lived her whole life. She wasn't going to go sell out just to get a favorable editorial in the Tribune. To get a favorable editorial in the Tribune, you really got to portray everything you believe, because that's where they're at. You get what I'm saying? So
I do.
She wasn't gonna suck up to the Sun-Times, get some dumbass editorial like "Get in line, teachers, shut up, take the money." The attitude, the hate that this city has for organized teachers is really baffling.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And, it actually makes me think it wasn't just when she got into union work that she had already lived a whole life. When she got into teaching, she had already lived a whole life, right? She didn't go to teaching straight after college. She did a number of different things. So her family, she has family in Oklahoma, and she kind of fled, honestly, Dartmouth towards the end. When she went so she started out at Mount Holyoke in college. She transferred to Dartmouth, and she was the first Black woman. She was the only Black woman in the graduating class in 1974. And I think it was a tough situation, also because Dartmouth had only just recently transitioned to being co-ed. So I think she was trying to get out of there. She actually finished up some of her work out, not in Dartmouth, and went to Oklahoma. And she lived a whole life in Oklahoma. She had her first marriage in Oklahoma. She had many different jobs. She worked for American Airlines. She worked for, she sold Ginsu knives. She was working at a drug rehabilitation center. She was a working at the Black newspaper in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that was the same Black newspaper that had been there since the Tulsa race massacre, right? So she had lived this entire life, and then I think still was trying to figure out exactly what she wanted to do. She went and lived in Barbados for a year. And when she was living in Barbados, she was like, well, she wanted to stay there a little longer. And they said, well, you need a special kind of visa or something to continue living here. And they said, well, what do you have to do to get that? And they were like, well, you need to be in a profession that we have a shortage of. And they said they had a shortage of doctors. So she came back to where I am, University of Illinois, Chicago. Wow. It may have been called Circle then. And went to medical school. Right? She tried medical school. She decided medical school wasn't for her. She was into chemistry, but medical school wasn't for her. She worked actually in the chemical industry for a little bit. All of this before coming to teaching. And in some ways, maybe she always was going to come to teaching. Yeah. Both of her parents were teachers, although I will note for both of them also who started outside of teaching and later entered the field of teaching. And in their case, it was different because they both went to school to be educators, to college. They're educated Black people at HBCU in Missouri, two different ones, and then came to Chicago, eventually became teachers, but they were barred from teaching initially. They couldn't get jobs as Black educators, full-time educators. Eventually were able to enter the teaching field. For her, I think it was a story of exploration before she eventually came to teaching. But when she came to teaching, she loved it. But even then, and she talks about this sometimes in the classroom, she says that she didn't really have the same sort of classroom management issues that some of her peers had. And she thought some of it was because she had lived a whole life. I'm a grown person. I'm an adult. I know who I am, to your point, and I'm not going to change. And I think that same disposition, that same sort of personality trait of hers, that set of experiences, she brought that also to her work in the union.
Yeah, wow. That is so true. There's so many dimensions to Karen Lewis. I'm going to avoid going down any path because it could be a half an hour tangent. But she loved movies.